So the Embargo Act, passed by the Republican Congress in 1807, signed by President Jefferson. It's largely President Jefferson's idea, and the logic is that Britain and France need our stuff more than we need theirs. So if we cut off all imports and exports, we can get them to respect us as a country and let us have the right to trade with who we want to. The embargo was devastating for the American economy, as you can see on the graph. Imports and exports both plummet. Overall U.S. trade dropped by 2/3. In the big cities, the effects were the worst. Merchants struggled to stay afloat. People who relied on ships coming and going for their jobs were out of work. Obviously, this decimated Baltimore, where an estimate that I saw said that overall trade went from a value of $7.5 million to $2 million. Sorry, that's just exports from Baltimore. Drops from $7.5 million to $2 million. That is devastation, Holmes. In Baltimore and in other cities outside Maryland, so if you go up the coast, like all the big cities, it led to a comeback by the Federalist Party. The party that, remember in our brief explanation, had been removed from power after the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that's what had led to Jefferson and the Republicans. But now, with lots of people disliking the effects of the embargo, the Federalists started to make a comeback. In the Maryland legislature, more Federalists were elected. And in Baltimore, this guy named Alexander Hanson, who was actually a native of Montgomery County, he lived right behind the Rockville courthouse. But he had moved to Baltimore, and he started publishing a Federalist newspaper called the Federal Republican. And he did that in 1808, riding the unpopularity of the embargo. Now, I've told you that Federalists were making a comeback, but Republicans were still the majority. And so Hanson, publishing this newspaper in Baltimore, was often harassed by Republicans. He carried a pistol because he was threatened regularly, and he believed the law should protect him. If it wouldn't, well, he would have to protect himself. The embargo didn't, my cat liked that part. I don't know if you heard her. The embargo did not get Britain or France to stop harassing American ships. The U.S. ended the embargo in 1809 and 1810, when James Madison had become the 4th U.S. president. And when the U.S. ended the embargo, they wound up in a position where they cut off trade with Britain, but still traded with France. If that sounds confusing to you, it's fine. You don't need to fully understand it, except that that was one of the things that wound up pulling the United States and Britain into war with one another. And that happened in 1812, when the U.S. Congress declared war on Britain. The Maryland members of the House of Representatives voted 6-3 in favor of declaring war. You can see over here that Federalists were unanimously against it. Republicans were strongly for it, but not unanimously. The Republicans who voted against it were mostly representing big cities. So they're feeling that pressure too. But the war is on. Now, it's going to be one of those things like the American Revolution where you're not going to get a clear sense of the War of 1812, just the way some of it affected Maryland. Which brings us back to Alexander Hansen and the Federal Republican, this Federalist newspaper in Baltimore. He wrote fiercely against the war, President Madison, and all the Republicans. He said that Madison was just a dupe being played by Irish immigrants who wanted the U.S. to go to war with Britain. He, in a whole series of editorials and cartoons, he, in a prodding, poking kind of way, was giving a hard time to the majority of the state's population, who liked the Republicans. This is one of his cartoons from the newspaper, The War Dance at Montgomery Courthouse, saying that the people who want war are savages, that they're like Indians. This outraged lots of people, the majority of people in Baltimore and across the state. Here is one of his editorials against the war. One thing that I should mention for this to make more sense. In this vote to go to war, the 3/5 clause made the difference. Remember that southern states got more representatives in the House because those states owned a lot of slaves. So if you do the math on it, if there was no 3/5 clause, it appears the vote to go to war would have narrowly been defeated. But there was a 3/5 clause. The vote to go to war was on, and that was a big part of the opposition to the war further north. People said that it was a war brought on by the way slavery, the slave owners, had more power in the government. That wasn't necessarily Hansen's argument. He was a slave owner himself. But he is arguing that we've gotten into this war in a disastrous way, and the people don't want it. Well, the people attacked his newspaper offices, burned him to the ground, and ran him out of town. But Hansen came back. He attacked the mobocracy that had burned his first offices, and the way they were not punished. So he came back, this time with some muscle. Some Federalists from around the area who were willing to help protect him. It included 2 veterans of the Revolutionary War who had risen to the rank of generals. Hansen, by bringing in Revolutionary War veterans, was trying to demonstrate that, he should have the right to free speech, even though the majority didn't like what he was saying. Well, the mob attacked a second time. This time, this brick building that he and his little crew of 11 or 12 guys had fortified. And the mob laid siege to it for hours. From inside, somebody in Hansen's crew fired out into the mob and killed one person, wounded some others. This just outraged the mob more. Now, after hours of this, the mob still hadn't gotten into this brick building, and the police showed up. Remember, Baltimore's got police. How about that? Police are on the scene. You know what I mean? So the police get into the building, talk to Hansen, And Hansen says, "Why don't you arrest that lawless mob in the street? Call out the militia." And this police guy says to Hansen, "That is the militia. If you want your lives saved, let me take you into custody and protect you down at the jail." So he and his crew surrender and are escorted, and they actually get them through the mob and down to the jail. But outside, the mob continues to drink and get drunker and angrier, and they attack the jail. Apparently there was collusion from inside, and they killed a veteran of the Revolutionary War. This guy, James Lingan, this general. Apparently at one part, as the mob attacked, he pulled his shirt open and showed them his wounds from the Revolutionary War. And was like, "Will you attack a man who gave this for his country?" And the mob killed him. General Henry Lighthorse Lee was badly mangled from his wounds, but recovered enough to die of his wounds a few years later. Hansen, badly beaten and mangled himself, was elected to the House of Representatives because the way the mob had treated Hansen led to a backlash that helped the Federalists. So Hansen served in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate. So this victim of mob violence in Baltimore went on to a political career that hurt him every day because of the beating that he had suffered. Is the beating he took likely contributed to his early death as well? He never really recovered his full health. Privateering was big, once again, and Baltimore-based privateers captured 550 British ships. That was 1/3 of all the British ships captured by American privateers. Baltimore killing it, getting out there, capturing British vessels, winning those prizes. Remember the way this works from back in the Revolution. The crew gets to keep the bulk of what they win. It was a way that ambitious young men could make some money, a way that wealthy investors could make more money, and it all was kind of patriotic. The British sailed their fleet into the Chesapeake Bay and began attacking and harassing places along the Chesapeake Bay, in Virginia and in Maryland. In June of 1813, they burned Havre de Grace up in, northeast Maryland. Prisoners that the Americans captured from the British side during the war, and again, you should be like, was there more of the war outside Maryland? Yes, we're not really covering it much. But those prisoners, some of them, were brought to the prisoner barracks that were created in the Revolution out in Frederick. So once again, those barracks out in Frederick served as a prisoner of war camp, as they had back in the Revolution. The burning of Havre de Grace, which, on the map is right up here. This was just one of all the sites that the British attacked and burned along the bay. And as they did, they welcomed help from Maryland's enslaved people. That is the enemy within. As this went on through 1813 and 1814, it's about a year and a half the British were in the Bay. And across that time, about 2,000 enslaved people made it to the British. Some helped the British in the field. Others just sought British protection. As in the Revolution, some wound up recaptured, some died amid the hardship of war, but as in the Revolution, when the war ended, the British took a bunch of enslaved people away to freedom. But those enslaved people helping the British during this campaign helped guide them as the British moved through the swamps outside D.C., intending to attack the nation's capital. Bladensburg on the map. Here's D.C. Here's Bladensburg. So Bladensburg is where the Americans were going to make their stand to defend the nation's capital. And Maryland militia, most especially from Baltimore, were on the front lines, critical to the battle at Bladensburg. And the American forces performed disastrously. They collapsed, the Marylanders leading the collapse, fleeing the battlefield, which left the British with a wide open path to go attack the nation's capital. The government fled. Madison, the cabinet, all in wild retreat from D.C. And the British set it on fire. Not the whole city, just the government buildings. This is a cartoon, Maddie in Full Flight. That's James Madison, the president. And Madison's route, fleeing D.C., brought him through Rockville, where he paused in Rockville. Then they moved on out to Brookville, and for one day, Brookville was the capital of the United States. Because that's where Madison and the cabinet tried to oversee the conduct of the war from. They feared that the British would continue to occupy D.C., but instead they burned it and left. So after one day in Brookville, they headed back to D.C. With the presidential mansion burned, it was rebuilt after the war, painted a bright white, and started to be called the White House. Huh? So, after burning D.C., the British headed now for Baltimore to destroy that nest of pirates that had been attacking their ships throughout this war. They were going to set Baltimore to fire, and lots of them didn't want to spare those buildings like they had in D.C. But they failed to take Baltimore. They bombed Fort McHenry from their ships in the harbor. And as they did, as the British bombed Fort McHenry from their ships, hoping for the fort to give in and for the flag to come down, this guy, Francis Scott Key, was a Marylander who was being held prisoner aboard one of those British ships that are bombing Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And Francis Scott Key saw the bombs bursting in air, which gave proof through the night that the flag was still there, that the American flag didn't come down, that Fort McHenry was not blown up, that it did not surrender. There's apparently this wild moment where one of the British explosives landed inside Fort McHenry, the fuse burning, just about to hit the explosive, detonate right against the main wall, which would have opened it up. And this soldier ran up and poured water on it, and the fuse went out right before exploding. So the flag stayed up, and the British failed to take Baltimore, and soon after retreated from the bay. A treaty was agreed to at the end of 1814. The war became pointless once Napoleon was removed from power in France. So the US and Britain agreed to a treaty, but the treaty wasn't known in the United States because the treaty was negotiated in Europe, right? There's no communication across the ocean that's instant. So in January 1815, the British attacked New Orleans, which was successfully defended by Andrew Jackson and the American forces fighting with him. This allowed Americans to create this narrative that they had won at New Orleans and then the British had agreed to surrender. That wasn't true, but it was a story that felt good, and the role of Baltimore refusing to bend and give in was part of that story that Americans told themselves about how they had beaten the British in the War of 1812. Even though that's not really what happened. This video was longer than I expected, and for that, I apologize.